The real reason I walked out on my wedding day was that my best friend confessed he was the father of my unborn child. Oscar started watching Korean TikToks in March. At first, it seemed harmless. He'd scroll through videos of Korean skincare routines and street food while we watched Netflix together on our old sectional couch. Then the comments started. "Korean girls just take better care of themselves," he said one evening, glancing at me over his phone. I was in my usual Old Navy sweatpants and oversized Target t-shirt. I'd worked a double shift and hadn't showered yet. The next week, he started pointing out specific things. "Look how straight her hair is, so shiny." He showed me a video of some influencer applying glossier lip balm. Korean beauty standards are just higher. By April, his phone usage doubled. He'd wake up at 6 a.m. and immediately start scrolling through Watch Her Korean Beauty and Watch Korean Girl hashtags. During dinner at our kitchen table, he'd hold up his phone, see how she does her makeup. Natural but still put together. I started wearing more makeup to my job. Bought a chai hair straightener from Target and used it every morning before work. Ordered Korean skincare products online. The CeraVe cleanser I'd used for 3 years went into the bathroom drawer. It wasn't enough. "You should really learn to do winged eyeliner like this," he said, showing me another video while I folded laundry on our bed. "And maybe lose some weight. Asian girls stay so petite." I signed up for Planet Fitness that week, started skipping lunch breaks at work, bought protein bars instead of my usual sandwich from the deli across from our office. Oscar started sleeping on the couch in late April. Said he needed better sleep for work, and I moved around too much at night. When I tried to initiate physical contact, he'd pull away. "I'm just not feeling it lately. Too much stress from work." He spent hours on his phone instead. The blue light from his screen lit up our bedroom until 3 a.m. while I lay awake listening to him scroll. He stopped complimenting anything about me. Stopped saying he loved me before leaving for his job at the auto parts store. When I wore the Korean face masks he'd shown me interest in, he barely looked up from his phone. When I tried the Korean fried chicken recipe I'd found online, he ate 2 bites and said he wasn't hungry. I started checking his recent apps when he left his phone on the kitchen counter. TikTok was always at the top. His liked videos were hundreds of Korean girls doing makeup tutorials, eating aesthetic meals, wearing crop tops and mini skirts. His search history showed Korean restaurants in our city, Korean language learning apps, Korean cultural sites. In early June, my dad called me at work. "I've been saving money for months to surprise you both," he said. "Oscar knows all about it. He's been helping me plan something special. Just wait, honey. He's going to surprise you soon." I hung up, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. Maybe this was why Oscar had been distant. Maybe he was planning something romantic. A vacation together. Time away from his phone and those videos. Maybe our relationship could get back to normal. I bought new clothes that weekend. A sundress from Nordstrom Rack. Sandals that would look good in photos. I researched romantic destinations online. Started imagining us on a beach somewhere. Oscar focused on me instead of his screen. The morning of June 15th, I woke up to an empty apartment. His side of the bed hadn't been slept in. His clothes were gone from our shared closet. His work uniform, his weekend clothes, his winter jacket, toothbrush gone from the bathroom holder, phone charger gone from his nightstand. Gaming headset gone from the computer desk. No note on the kitchen table, no text message, no missed call. I called him 18 times between 7 a.m. and noon. Every call went straight to voicemail. His voicemail box was full. I drove to his workplace. His manager said he'd called in sick. I went to his friend Jerry's house. Jerry said he hadn't seen Oscar in 2 weeks. I contacted his brother in Phoenix, his mom in Tampa, his coworkers from previous jobs, his college roommate. Nobody had heard from him. I filed a missing person report on June 16th. The police officer said adults have the right to leave. Asked if there were signs of depression or financial problems. Jerry finally called me on June 18th. "I didn't want to get involved," he said. "But I need to show you something Oscar sent me." He forwarded me a WhatsApp photo. Oscar standing at the airport gate, grinning, holding up his boarding pass. The text on the ticket was clear. American Airlines Flight 271 to Incheon International Airport, Seoul. Departure June 15th, 5:30 a.m. One way. When I called my dad to tell him Oscar was gone, he broke down crying. "I gave him $15,000, he said. "My retirement savings." He said it was for your surprise trip together. That night, I sat on our couch where he'd spent months watching videos of Korean girls while planning his escape. I looked at the Korean skincare products on my bathroom counter. The eyeliner I'd practiced applying every morning, the gym membership card in my wallet, the sundress I'd bought for our imaginary romantic getaway. 12,000 miles away, Oscar was living his Korean fantasy with my father's retirement money. He thought he could just disappear from his life, from our shared apartment, from the promises he'd made. He thought he could leave me sitting here with his empty side of the closet and my dad's broken heart. First update, the next 3 days were absolute chaos and I'm still trying to process everything that went down. First off, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. Seriously, you guys kept me sane when I thought I was losing my mind. Special shout out to the person who said he's probably going to come crawling back when reality hits because boy were you right about that part. So, after I found out Oscar had flown to Seoul with my dad's retirement money, I immediately tried calling him again, still going straight to voicemail. I sent him about 20 WhatsApp messages that first night, ranging from confused to furious. The messages showed as delivered but never read. I even tried Instagram DMs, Snapchat, Facebook Messenger, basically every platform we'd ever used. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, except I knew exactly where he was. My dad came over on June 19th and we had the most heartbreaking conversation I've ever had with him. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Oscar used to show me those stupid Korean beauty videos, and just sobbed. Turns out Oscar had been working on him for weeks. Started in early May, right around the time he stopped sleeping in our bed. Oscar told my dad he wanted to propose to me somewhere special, somewhere I'd never expect. Said he'd been researching Korean culture because I was so interested in it and wanted to take me to Seoul for the proposal. My dad was so excited about the idea of helping with a surprise proposal that he didn't ask questions he should have asked. Oscar had shown my dad printed screenshots of hotel prices, flight costs, restaurant reservations. Made it seem like $15,000 was exactly what they needed for this amazing 2E romantic trip. My dad said Oscar even teared up talking about how much he loved me and wanted to make me happy. I wanted to scream. This man had been mentally checked out of our relationship for months while simultaneously convincing my father he was planning the romantic gesture of a lifetime. The worst part is my dad kept apologizing to me. He said he'd been so proud that his future son-in-law cared enough to plan something special. He'd been bragging to his friends at work about how thoughtful Oscar was. My dad works construction and has been saving every extra dollar for retirement. $15,000 represented months of overtime, skipped lunches, driving his old truck instead of getting it fixed properly. And Oscar knew all of this because my dad had told him about his financial situation when Oscar first brought up the proposal trip idea. I spent hours going through Oscar's social media accounts that first weekend. His Instagram was still active, but he hadn't posted anything since June 10th. His last post was a selfie with the caption, "Big changes coming soon," that I'd thought was about our relationship getting better. His TikTok account showed he'd been liking Korean content right up until June 14th, the day before he left. But starting June 15th, nothing. No activity anywhere. What really pissed me off was looking through his old comments on those Korean beauty TikToks. I'd never thought to check before because I trusted him, but I went deep into his reposts. This man had been commenting on videos for months, not just liking them, actively commenting things like "so beautiful" and "perfect skin" and asking questions about Korean skincare routines. One comment from May made me want to throw my phone across the room. He'd written, "My girlfriend should learn from you," on some influencer's morning routine video. But then I found something that made everything click into place. On June 12th, Oscar had commented on a video from some account called Akimi Sun Beauty saying, "Can't wait to meet you soon." The account had replied, "See you in Seoul AA" with heart emojis. I clicked on the profile and it was exactly what you'd expect. Perfect Korean girl, flawless skin, designer clothes, aesthetic coffee shop photos, the kind of account that Oscar had been obsessing over for months, except something felt off about it. All the photos looked almost too perfect, like they were edited within an inch of their lives. I screenshot everything before the account could disappear or block me. Then I did what any sane person would do. I sent Oscar a WhatsApp message with all the screenshots attached. I told him I knew about a Kim Jong beauty and I knew he'd gone to Seoul to meet her, not for any surprise proposal. I told him he'd stolen my father's retirement money for his Korean fantasy girl, and that he was the most pathetic excuse for a human being I'd ever met. I said I hoped she was worth destroying 2 families for. The message delivered but still wasn't read. Meanwhile, my dad was calling the bank to see if there was any way to reverse the wire transfer he'd sent to Oscar's account. The bank said since my dad had authorized the transfer willingly, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested filing a police report for fraud, but my dad didn't want to press charges immediately because he still hoped Oscar would return the money voluntarily. My dad is too good for this world. By June 22nd, I was getting calls from Oscar's mom asking if I knew where he was. His family had no idea he'd left the country. His mom said he told them he was taking some personal time to work on things, but hadn't mentioned traveling anywhere. When I told her he was in South Korea, she went silent for like 30 seconds. Then she asked if this was related to his Asian girl obsession that his brother had mentioned to her a few weeks earlier. Apparently Oscar had been talking to his family about Korean culture and how much better Asian women are at taking care of themselves for months. His mom was mortified. She said she'd noticed Oscar making weird comments about appearance whenever they video called, asking why American women couldn't be more like Korean women. She thought it was just a phase, like when he got obsessed with cryptocurrency last year, or when he spent 3 months convinced he was going to become a personal trainer. But this was different. This time, he'd actually acted on his obsession and hurt real people. The most infuriating part of all this is that I still hadn't heard directly from Oscar. Not one word. It had been a full week since he'd abandoned our shared life and stolen my father's money, and he hadn't even tried to explain himself. I kept checking the Kim Jong Beauty account, but it had gone private after I found it. I tried creating a fake Instagram account to follow her, but she wasn't accepting new followers. Then yesterday, something interesting happened. Jerry called me around 8 p.m. and said he'd gotten a weird message from Oscar. Not a call, just a text message from an international number. All it said was, "Need to talk to you urgently. Don't tell anyone yet." Jerry had responded asking what was wrong and where Oscar was, but got no reply. Jerry forwarded me the screenshot and asked if I thought something had happened to Oscar in Korea. Looking at that message, I could tell something had gone wrong for Oscar. The man who'd been so confident in his plan that he'd stolen $15,000 and disappeared without a word was suddenly reaching out urgently to his friend back home, but he still hadn't contacted me or my father. He was still being a coward about facing the people he'd actually hurt. I told Jerry to respond if Oscar texted again, but to make it clear that Oscar needed to call me and my dad immediately if he wanted any help with whatever situation he'd gotten himself into. I wasn't going to let him triangulate through his friends while avoiding accountability for what he'd done. Because here's the thing, I have a feeling Oscar's Korean fantasy isn't going exactly how he planned it. And when reality comes crashing down on him, he's going to want to come running back to the life he abandoned. But I'm not the same person who used to straighten her hair every morning trying to live up to his Korean beauty standards. I'm done being his backup plan. Second update. I'm typing this at 2 a.m. because I literally cannot sleep after everything that happened today. So remember how Oscar had sent that cryptic urgent message to Jerry? Well, yesterday morning at 11 a.m., my phone started ringing with an international number. I almost didn't answer because I get spam calls all the time. And there he was, Oscar's voice sounding absolutely desperate and panicked in a way I'd never heard before. The connection was terrible and he kept cutting out, but I could hear enough to know he was falling apart. He started talking immediately without even saying hello. Just launched into this frantic explanation about how everything had gone wrong and he needed help getting home. I interrupted him and told him if he thought he could just call me after stealing my father's retirement money and disappearing for over a week. He had another thing coming. That's when he really started begging. He said he was stranded at some guest house in Seoul with no money and his return flight had been cancelled. He claimed his credit cards weren't working and he couldn't access his bank account from Korea. He kept saying it was all a misunderstanding and he could explain everything if I would just help him figure out how to get home. The audacity of this man calling me for help after what he'd done was absolutely incredible. I told him he had exactly one chance to explain where my father's $15,000 went and why he'd lied about planning a proposal. That's when his story started falling apart completely. He claimed he had been planning to propose, but decided to scout out Seoul first to make sure it would be perfect for me. Said he'd used the money for a research trip and was planning to bring me back later. When I asked why he'd packed all his belongings for a research trip, he started stuttering and talking in circles. Then I brought up Kim Ji and the comment about meeting her soon. Oscar went completely silent for like 30 seconds. The silence was so long I thought the call had dropped. He tried to tell me that account was just some travel blogger who'd been giving him advice about Seoul. Nothing romantic or inappropriate. But when I read back his exact comment about how his girlfriend should learn from her, he couldn't explain that away. He started getting defensive, saying I was twisting innocent interactions into something sinister. He claimed he'd only been trying to learn about Korean culture to make our future trip better. When I asked him why he needed to pack all his clothes and quit his job for cultural research, he said I was being too suspicious and not giving him a chance to explain properly. The conversation was going in circles and I could feel myself getting angrier with every word. Oscar then tried a different approach. He started talking about how much stress he'd been under at work and how he'd been feeling lost in our relationship. He said seeing Korean culture online had made him realize there were different ways to approach life and relationships, and he'd gotten excited about exploring that with me. When I pointed out that he'd been criticizing my appearance for months while praising Korean women, he said I was misremembering conversations and taking things out of context. Oscar kept changing his story, trying different angles to make himself sound less guilty. First, it was research for our future proposal trip. Then, it was a spontaneous adventure to surprise me. Then, it was work stress making him act irrational. Every time I cornered him with specific evidence, he'd pivot to a new explanation. He never once apologized for lying to my father or stealing the money. What really got me angry was when he started trying to turn it around on me. He said I'd been obsessed with Korean beauty standards and he was just trying to understand what I found so appealing about that culture. Can you believe this manipulation? This man had spent months telling me I wasn't pretty enough or thin enough compared to Korean girls, and now he was acting like his obsession was somehow my fault. He said I'd been the one buying Korean skincare products and straightening my hair, like I'd done that for my own enjoyment instead of trying to meet his impossible standards. I reminded him about every specific comment he'd made. The time he told me Korean girls stay petite while looking at my stomach after I'd eaten dinner. The morning he showed me a TikTok of some influencer's skincare routine and asked why I couldn't put that much effort into my appearance. The night he said Asian women just naturally have better hair texture while I was struggling with the cheese straightener I'd bought because of his comments. Each time I brought up a specific example, Oscar claimed I was exaggerating or that I'd misunderstood his meaning. I finally told him I was done listening to his lies and he needed to call my father immediately to arrange paying back the money. That's when Oscar completely lost it. He started yelling about how I didn't understand what he was going through and how complicated the situation had become. He said he was in trouble and needed support from his girlfriend, not accusations and demands. He actually had the nerve to say I was being unsympathetic during his crisis. I hung up on him, but Oscar wasn't done. He called back 6 more times that day. I answered the first few because I wanted to give him multiple chances to tell the truth. But each conversation was the same pattern. Frantic begging, constantly changing explanations and attempts to manipulate me into feeling sorry for him. During the second call, he tried crying and saying he'd made terrible mistakes, but still wouldn't admit what he'd actually done wrong. He kept saying things like, I love you and I never meant for it to go this far, without explaining what a T actually was. By the third call, Oscar was trying to negotiate. He said if I could just wire him enough money for a flight home, he'd pay my father back immediately once he got to his bank. When I asked him what had happened to the $15,000 he'd left with, he said it was complicated and he'd explain everything in person. He promised he'd never ask me for anything again if I could just help him this one time. I told him the only person he should be calling for help was my father, whose money he'd stolen. The fourth call was when Oscar started getting angry at me. He said I was being vindictive and refusing to help someone I claimed to love during a genuine emergency. He said if the situation were reversed, he would have already wired me money without asking so many questions. He tried to make me feel guilty for not immediately rushing to rescue him from whatever trouble he'd gotten himself into. When I pointed out that he'd created this situation by lying and stealing, he said I was being petty and holding grudges instead of focusing on solving the current problem. The worst part was how he kept insisting he loved me and had never meant to hurt anyone. He said his feelings for me hadn't changed and everything he'd done was supposed to benefit our relationship somehow. When I asked how lying to my father and stealing his money benefited our relationship, Oscar said I was being too emotional to understand his reasoning. He actually told me I needed to calm down and think logically about the situation. That's when my mom got involved. She'd been staying with me since Monday because she was worried about how I was handling everything. My mom had been friends with my dad since their divorce 10 years ago. They get along better now than when they were married, and she was furious about what Oscar had done to him. When she heard me on the phone getting more and more upset with each call from Oscar, she'd been pacing around my living room getting angrier by the minute. During Oscar's 6th call, when I was starting to cry from frustration, my mom had enough. She grabbed the phone right out of my hand and put it on speaker. I have never seen my mother this angry in my entire life. She told Oscar he was a pathetic excuse for a man who had stolen money from a hard-working father and broken his daughter's heart with his disgusting obsession with fantasy women online. She said if he called me one more time without having $15,000 to wire back to my father, she would personally fly to Seoul and drag him back by his ears. My mom is 5 feet tall and works as a kindergarten teacher, but she sounded absolutely terrifying. Oscar tried to interrupt her and say hello, but she shut him down immediately. She told him she'd heard every conversation he'd had with me that day, and she was disgusted by his attempts to manipulate me into feeling sorry for him. She said she'd watched her daughter lose weight and change her entire appearance trying to meet his standards. And now he had the audacity to call her for help after abandoning her for some online fantasy. Oscar tried to argue with my mom, saying she didn't understand the full situation and I was painting him as worse than he really was. He said I was only telling her the bad parts of our relationship and leaving out all the good times we'd had together. My mom shut that down immediately. She told him she'd seen the Korean skincare products he'd pressured me to buy, heard about his comments comparing me to other women, and watched me skip meals trying to meet his impossible standards. She said any man who would make his girlfriend feel inadequate while planning to abandon her was beyond redemption. Then my mom started asking Oscar direct questions that he couldn't deflect. She wanted to know exactly how much money he'd spent and on what. She asked him why he'd quit his job if this was supposed to be a short research trip. She demanded to know why he'd packed winter clothes for a summer trip to Seoul. With each question, Oscar's answers became more obviously false and contradictory. When my mom asked him about Kim Jong Beauty, Oscar tried to claim he'd never heard that name before. My mom told him she'd seen the screenshots I'd taken of his comments and liked videos. She asked him if he thought we were stupid enough to believe he'd forgotten about an account he'd been obsessing over for months. Oscar then admitted he'd talked to some Korean accounts online, but insisted it was purely educational and cultural exchange. The conversation between Oscar and my mom lasted 20 minutes, and I could hear him getting more desperate as she destroyed every excuse he tried to make. She asked him why he needed to meet Korean women in person if he was just interested in cultural education. She wanted to know why he'd lied to my father about planning a proposal instead of just saying he wanted to travel alone. She asked him how stealing someone's retirement savings was supposed to improve his relationship with their daughter. My mom also brought up things I hadn't even thought to mention. She asked Oscar why he'd stopped contributing to our shared household expenses in May while planning this expensive trip. She wanted to know why he'd been so secretive about his phone use if he was just learning about Korean culture. She pointed out that he'd been treating me like a roommate instead of a girlfriend for months while apparently planning our romantic future together. By the end of that call, Oscar was sobbing and admitting that things had gotten more complicated than he'd planned, but still insisting he could fix everything if we just gave him time. My mom told him he had 48 hours to wire the money back or we were involving the police. She said she didn't care what kind of trouble he'd gotten himself into in Korea. That was his problem to solve. She hung up and immediately called my dad to update him on the situation. My dad came over that evening and the three of us sat in my living room having the most honest conversation we'd had in years. My mom made coffee and we spread out all the evidence I'd collected. Screenshots of Oscar's comments, his liked videos, the messages between him and various Korean accounts. My dad admitted he felt stupid for believing Oscar's proposal story without asking more questions. He said Oscar had been so convincing and emotional when talking about wanting to make me happy that it never occurred to him it might be manipulation. My mom pointed out that Oscar had specifically targeted my dad's weakness, his love for me and desire to help with romantic milestones. My dad was especially hurt by how Oscar had used their relationship. Oscar had been coming to family dinners for 2 years, borrowing my dad's tools, asking for advice about work and life. My dad had started thinking of Oscar as the son he'd never had. He'd been so proud when Oscar came to him about planning a proposal. Felt honored that this young man trusted him enough to ask for help with such an important moment. But here's where things get really interesting. Oscar called again this morning, and this time he sounded completely different. Not desperate or manipulative, just defeated and scared. He claimed someone had scammed him and he'd lost everything. But he still wouldn't give me specifics over the phone. He just kept saying it was worse than I could imagine and he'd been stupid to trust the wrong person. I told him if he wanted my help understanding his situation, he needed to start by being completely honest about Kim Jong Beauty and what he'd really gone to Seoul to do. There was another long silence and then Oscar said something that made everything click into place. He said the person he'd gone to meet wasn't who they claimed to be and now he was stuck in a foreign country with no money and no way home. He admitted he'd never actually planned to propose to me in Seoul. He said he'd met someone online who he thought was perfect and had convinced himself that meeting her in person would solve all his problems with our relationship. He'd used my father's money to fund what he now realized was a completely delusional fantasy. But something had gone very wrong when he tried to meet this person. And now he was scared and alone and didn't know what to do. That's when I realized Oscar's Korean fantasy had turned into his worst nightmare. And tomorrow he's supposed to call me back to explain exactly what kind of trouble he's gotten himself into. Because despite everything he's done to me and my family, I need to know the truth about what happened to those $15,000. My mom thinks I should just hang up on him. But I have to know how this story ends. Final update, guys. Guys, I am absolutely dead from what just happened. I cannot believe this is real life, but I have to share this with you because it's the most pathetic, hilarious, karma-filled ending to this whole nightmare that I could have ever imagined. Grab some popcorn because this is the most satisfying conclusion you will ever read. So Oscar called me back this morning like he promised and my mom was sitting right next to me because she wanted to hear whatever excuse he was going to come up with this time. I put him on speaker immediately because I was done with his lies and wanted to witness to whatever manipulation he was about to try. He started talking and I could tell immediately that something was different. His voice was completely broken, like he'd been crying for hours. He said he needed to tell me the complete truth about what had happened in Seoul and why he'd really gone there. He said he was ashamed and humiliated, but he had to be honest because he needed our help getting home. Then Oscar told me the most ridiculous story I have ever heard in my entire life. Are you ready for this? Kim Jong Beauty wasn't a real person. She was a complete fake created by scammers using AI technology to generate fake photos, videos, and even voice messages. This grown man had spent months obsessing over, comparing me to, and eventually traveling across the world to meet someone who was entirely fabricated by criminals. I started laughing immediately. I couldn't help it. The laughter just bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me and I could not stop. My mom was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. But I was cackling. This man had destroyed our relationship, stolen my father's retirement money, and abandoned our shared life for a fake person created by scammers with computer software. Oscar kept talking while I was laughing, trying to explain how it had happened. He said Kim Jong-un Beauty had started direct messaging him in early May, sending photos and videos that looked completely real because they were generated using AI face-swapping technology. The scammers had even sent him voice messages that sounded like a real Korean girl speaking English, but it was all artificial. They'd had detailed conversations about Korean culture with her complimenting his appearance and telling him he was handsome and interesting. She'd said she was looking for an American boyfriend and thought he was perfect. They'd been talking every day for weeks. I was still giggling while he explained this because the mental image of Oscar having deep romantic conversations with literal scammers, pretending to be his dream girl, was absolutely killing me. My mom started to understand what was happening and her face was a mixture of horror and second-hand embarrassment. Oscar said the fake girl had convinced him that Korean women were superior to American women in every way and that he deserved someone who would appreciate him properly. The criminals had suggested he come to Seoul to meet her. She'd given him specific instructions about where to stay, what to bring, how much money he'd need. She'd sent him an address for a coffee shop where they were supposed to meet on June 16th. Oscar said he'd been so excited he could barely sleep on the plane. He'd imagined this perfect romantic meeting where his ideal woman would finally be real. When I asked him what happened when he got to the coffee shop, Oscar's voice got even smaller. He said he'd waited there for 6 hours. The coffee shop staff had started to feel sorry for him. He'd messaged Kim Jong Beauty asking where she was, but all his messages were being ignored. By evening he'd realized something was wrong and tried calling the phone number she'd given him. It was disconnected. That's when he'd gone back to her Instagram account and discovered it was completely gone, deleted, like it had never existed. He'd tried searching for her name, her photos, anything that would prove she was real. Nothing. He'd spent the next 2 days frantically messaging other Korean accounts he'd been following, asking if anyone knew Kim Jong-beauty. Most of them ignored him, but a few told him he'd been scammed by a catfish operation. I asked Oscar how much money he'd sent her before flying to Seoul. And this is where it gets even more pathetic. He'd sent her $3,000 in the weeks before his trip. She'd asked for money for new clothes to look perfect for their date, for her phone bill so they could keep talking, for emergencies with her sick grandmother. Classic scam requests that Oscar had fallen for completely because he was thinking with the wrong head. So let me get this straight. Oscar had used my father's $15,000 to fly to Seoul, spent another $3,000 on a fake woman and was now stranded in Korea with no money because he'd fallen in love with a computer program. I was laughing so hard I had tears streaming down my face. My mom had to get up and get me tissues because I was a complete mess. But wait, it gets worse. Oscar said he'd been trying to figure out how to get home for days, but his credit cards were maxed out from his previous spending on Korean culture obsession stuff and the money he'd sent to the fake account. His bank account was empty because of his proposal trip purchases. He'd been staying at the cheapest guest house he could find and eating convenience store food, but he was running out of money for even that. He'd finally swallowed his pride and called his parents to ask for help. This is where my mom and I both stopped laughing because we knew his parents were decent people who didn't deserve this. Oscar said he'd had to explain to his mother why he was in Korea alone, why he needed money for a flight home, and why he'd quit his job and left his girlfriend without explanation. His mother had been so confused and angry that she'd put his father on the phone. Oscar said he'd never heard his dad sound so disappointed and disgusted in his entire life. His father had asked him if he'd really stolen money from his girlfriend's family to chase after some woman online. When Oscar admitted that the woman wasn't even real, his father had called him pathetic and said he was ashamed to have raised such a fool. His mother had started crying when she understood that he'd manipulated my father's love for me to fund his fantasy. His father had said Oscar was a disgrace to their family. They'd agreed to wire him money for a flight home, but only so they could deal with him face to face. But here's the best part. Oscar's parents had called my parents. His mother had gotten my dad's number from Oscar and called to apologize for her son's behavior. She'd offered to pay back the $15,000 immediately, even though it would drain their emergency savings. My mom said my dad had been so touched by the call that he'd started crying. Oscar's parents were taking full responsibility for their son's actions, even though they'd had no idea what he was planning. When Oscar told me about his parents calling mine, I lost it completely. I told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a human being I'd ever encountered. I said he'd destroyed multiple families because he couldn't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. I told him he was so desperate and sad that he'd fallen in love with a computer program and abandoned real people who actually cared about him. My mom took the phone from me because I was getting too worked up. She told Oscar that his parents had shown more integrity in one phone call than he'd shown in the entire 2 years she'd known him. She said watching a man in his 20s get scammed by an obvious fake account was like watching a child touch a hot stove after being warned not to. She told him he was an embarrassment to his family and that his parents deserved better than cleaning up his messes. Oscar started crying on the phone and begging us to understand that he'd made mistakes, but he'd learned his lesson. He said he realized now that I was the best thing that had ever happened to him and he wanted to come home and fix our relationship. He promised he'd never look at Korean content again and would delete all his social media if I just give him another chance. I took the phone back and told Oscar that he was absolutely out of his mind if he thought I wanted anything to do with him after this. I said I wouldn't take him back if he was the last man on earth. I told him he'd spent months making me feel ugly and inadequate compared to a fake person. And now he wanted sympathy because his fantasy had crashed and burned. I explained to Oscar that I'd already started moving on with my life. I'd been going to the gym because I actually enjoyed it, not to meet his impossible standards. I'd kept using the Korean skincare products because they worked well for my skin, not because some AI had perfect skin and doctored photos. I'd learned that I could be happy and confident without his constant criticism and manipulation. Oscar kept trying to interrupt me to say he'd changed and realized his mistakes, but I shut him down every time. I told him that change meant taking full responsibility for his actions, not just feeling sorry for himself when his plan backfired. Real change would have been him realizing months ago that comparing his girlfriend to other women was abusive behavior. Real change would have been him discussing his travel plans with me instead of lying to my father. My mom added that real change would have been Oscar getting a second job to pay for his Korean fantasy instead of stealing someone else's retirement savings. She said if he'd wanted to meet Korean women so badly, he could have joined legitimate cultural exchange programs or language learning groups in our city. Instead, he'd chosen the most destructive and selfish path possible. When Oscar realized neither of us was going to forgive him or help him beyond this conversation, he started getting angry. He said I was being vindictive and holding grudges instead of supporting him during a difficult time. He said if I really loved him, I'd want to help him learn from his mistakes rather than punishing him forever. He actually had the nerve to say that my reaction was proving that Korean women were more forgiving and understanding than American women. That's when I completely lost my. I told Oscar that Korean women would also think he was pathetic and wouldn't want anything to do with him. I said the only reason the AI had been nice to him was because it was programmed to scam money from lonely losers like him. I told him that real Korean women were probably just as disgusted by his fetishization of their culture as I was. Before ending the call, I told Oscar that his flight home was his parents' problem to solve, not mine. I said when he got back to our city he needed to stay away from me and my family completely. I told him my dad had already changed his locks and phone number because he didn't want to deal with Oscar's drama anymore. I said if Oscar tried to contact any of us again, we'd involve the police. Oscar's parents did wire him money for a flight home. And according to Jerry, he's been back for 3 days now. Apparently, he's staying with his parents because he has nowhere else to go. His mother has been calling everyone in their family to apologize for Oscar's behavior, and his father has been telling people that Oscar is banned from using their internet until he gets professional help. Jerry said Oscar's parents are making him get a job immediately to start paying back the money they spent on his flight and the money they're giving my father. They've also told him he needs to see a therapist about his internet addiction and his problems with reality. Jerry thinks Oscar's mother is more embarrassed than she's ever been in her life. My dad got his $15,000 back yesterday, and Oscar's parents included an extra $1,000 as an apology for the stress their son caused. My dad said he's never accepting financial help for wedding planning again, but he's proud of how I handled the whole situation. My mom has been telling everyone she knows about Oscar's AI girlfriend situation because she thinks it's the funniest and most pathetic thing she's ever heard. She keeps saying she can't believe she wasted 2 years being nice to someone who couldn't tell the difference between a person and a computer program. So that's the end of my Korean catfish saga. To everyone who said he'd come crawling back when reality hit, you were absolutely right. But this reality was so much more pathetic than any of us could have imagined. Update: Oscar apparently tried to create a new Instagram account yesterday to message me an apology. I blocked him immediately and reported the account. His parents found out and took his phone away. A grown man had his phone taken away by his parents because he can't stop trying to contact the woman he abandoned for an AI. I cannot with this.